This video will contain spoilers for the entire numbered Xenoblade Chronicles trilogy. And yes, I do re-record that line every time I need to use it. Something a lot of people who are fans of Xeno like talking about, and something I've brought up frequently on this channel, is the idea that there are two main classes of major villains in Xeno games. You have the big bad type villains, who are usually the final boss, and are almost always irredeemable, often less complex, and more explicitly evil without much sympathy being thrown towards them, while on the other hand you have another villain who is usually big and important, but tends to get defeated first, and has a much more sympathetic backstory that makes you actually feel bad about defeating them. More recently, both Xenoblade 2 and 3 have bucked this trend somewhat. In 2, the concept of the sympathetic villain was taken and made into an entire group of characters, which is how we got the wonderful, lovable Torna. The thing about that is, just making it a group of characters is the big paradigm shift. The big paradigm shift comes in the fact that a member of the sympathetic villain group is actually the final boss. While Jin is the leader of Torna and arguably the most powerful outside of an artifice, and is defeated before Amalthus, whose fault all of this actually is, Malas is still the final boss and ultimately the greater threat, albeit even he admits that it's because of Amalthus he turned out this way. In 3, instead of making an additional antagonistic faction, and making that the one the sympathetic villains belong to, they just have one antagonistic faction in the entire game, so not only the sympathetic villains are all in the same group, but all of the villains are in the same group, because guess what? Everything and everyone is secretly Mobius. 3 arguably has 4 characters that fall under the sympathetic villain archetype, at least how Xeno as a whole tends to define it. N, M, Yorin, and Shania. Out of those 4, M was a double agent the entire time, so while she did do things to help Mobius, I'm not sure she should really count as a villain at all, especially because she betrayed Mobius to the party as soon as she got a chance to do so, and her deciding to do that was not a result of character development or coming to a realization out of anything. Shania is optional, so while her story is fantastic, I really don't know how to categorize her. Yorin doesn't really get a whole lot of screen time, and yet he comes the closest to doing the entire sympathetic villain plot straight, because his storyline ends with him coming to a realization and sacrificing himself to help out the party by taking someone out. But N is the real standout here because he is the main sympathetic villain. He gets the most screen time out of all of them, gets the most explicitly shown tragic backstory that also lasts longer than anyone else's, and is the one who is the most related to by the protagonist, which is very important in something like this, because he is quite literally another version of Noah, and yet he stays on Zed's side the entire time. Even if they die fighting the party and don't get a chance to make the sacrifice like someone like Jin or Yorin did, Xeno's sympathetic villains always go down knowing who the real enemy is and that it isn't the party. And yet N is just a lackey for Zed the entire time. While yes, N and M do sacrifice themselves to destroy Mobius for good and reboot Origin at the end, that's still after the final boss was already defeated in gameplay and alongside M, who was never pro-Endless now to begin with, so I kind of count that sacrifice as a bit lesser than all of the other ones, so I still do think that counts as a big, standout, different thing. That being said, we can kind of just not talk about N for the rest of the video, because that is not the aspect of 3's treatment of sympathetic villains I really want to talk about here. I want to talk about another way 3 is the thematic culmination to the entire trilogy, in the amount it respects and honors the ideals and actions of the sympathetic villains from both 1 and 2, to the point where the heroic party of 3 is the one who adopts some of those ideals and takes some of those actions, and I would even go as far as to say that Egil from 1, and using Malas as a representative of Torna from 2, would be fighting on the side of Ouroboros if they were plopped into Ionios during the story of 3. Unfortunately, this does come with one somewhat major caveat, and that is the Xenoblade 2 connections are going to be a bit noticeably stronger than the Xenoblade 1 connections here, and that is entirely another unfortunate consequence of how the series was made. 1 was fully conceptualized as a standalone game that was originally not even supposed to be Xeno, let alone the start of its own Xeno trilogy, while 2 was not only supposed to be a sequel and a successor to 1, but they also had the base idea for 3 while they were making 2, so there were a lot of places where they could have intentionally left things to be picked up later on, whereas in 1, they were mostly drawing out threads from something that was mostly completely wrapped up. So you'll notice that the quantity of Egil stuff is going to be smaller compared to Malos, but that does not reflect at all on the quality of it and its importance to the overall thematic through-line present in Xenoblade 3. To start with the very obvious, of course, both Egil and Malos would hate Mobius. That doesn't even need to be said. An immensely powerful, controlling being in Zed who believes himself to be above everyone else and tries to control the entire world, stringing things from the shadows only to his own benefit, who forces his own hatred of the world onto people, stripping away their individuality and taking away the things and people they love, forcing them to just be weapons in a war. Yeah, getting done dirty by people like that is literally how you turn out as a sympathetic Xenovillain, and, you know, Zed basically does the things that Zanza did to make Egil turn out the way he did, and the things that Amalthus did to make Malos and Jin turn out the way they did, to everyone in Ionios at the same time, over and over again, as a sizable population of those people is reborn constantly for over 1,000 years. In addition to that, on a slightly more personal level for the characters, there are aspects of Zed and Mobius that I think directly reflect very specific quotes they have. From Egil, "This world is in disarray. I must eliminate the cause of this disorder and restore the world to its original form. This is my duty, nay, the will of the world." So, yeah. I know they weren't thinking about sequels really when they made Xenoblade 1, but they still made Egil basically spell out the entire plot of Xenoblade 3 there. Don't really know what else to say. That is the video game we all played. And then in Torna, when Malos is explaining why he hates humanity so much, he comes out with, "They see the divine flame of life and piss all over it. They're genius at that." The people who led Amalthus to hate the world so much that he awoke a blade that came out like Malos did are the same kind of people who became Mobius in Xenoblade 3. Even outside of the idea of the Endless Now, the world is still a cycle. People like that will always exist and rise to power, but then people like Shulk and Rex and Noah and Mio will always find a way to seize the future for themselves. That is quite possibly the single most fundamental unifying theme of the entire Xeno series. I am not just talking about Blade anymore. Can you see what I mean when I say that Xenoblade 3 is a thematic culmination of the last 24 years of games? And then there's the actual actions Egil took. In order to take the fight to Zanza, he hid himself out in a secluded place in the Makanis that he could not easily reach. Then he developed a robot army, the majority of which was autonomous but did have humanoid piloted vehicles as well, and additionally developed a system to control the Makanis itself. That is, the entire place he was living could be turned into a mech to try and fight against Zanza. And while not the Ouroboros members we play as, an earlier generation of Ouroboros, the founders of the city, created a secluded place for people fighting against Mobius to live that they could not find or easily reach without knowing exactly where it was, developed a unique kind of leftness that Keves and Agnes both did not have, the majority of which was autonomous, but they did have human-piloted versions, and the entire city is Gilgamesh. So they made the place they live into a giant mech as well. That is cool, but not actually what I was talking about, and this is where it kind of gets really grim. I should probably be taking a different tone of voice here. Something the main cast Ouroboros of 3 are responsible for, though, is restarting Origin and resplitting the two worlds. One of the side effects of this action, though, is effectively erasing anyone who is not from the original two worlds from existence, largely meaning Napon and people from the city. Contrast this with the fact that Egil was perfectly willing to destroy all life on Bionis, including sentient people like Hams, Napon, and Hyentia, in order to further his goals. Now, obviously, there are a few differences between these two instances. First off, Egil is far, far more callous about it, reveling in the fact that he's killing people, and every time he does so, rubbing it in the face of the party members, while the Ouroboros in 3, first off, consulted city leaders about it and informed them this is what would be happening if their plan succeeded, because Monica and Gondor obviously knew about it, and, more crucially, actually felt bad about the sacrifice to the point of second-guessing the plan in its final stages, despite the fact that that would turn them into the next generation of Mobius. Despite that though, the fact does remain that both were willing to sacrifice an unfathomably large number of people in order to permanently destroy the blight on the world. Admittedly though, neither of these sacrifices actually went through for the most part. Egil was stopped before he could kill the majority of people on Bionis, and while his plan was to kill them all to starve Zanza of food, Zanza ended up waking up and deciding to kill everyone anyway, so the sacrifice was completely pointless, though of course the party then stops Zanza, and everyone who's alive at that point does get carried over into the new world. And in 3, while it is left explicitly ambiguous, it is extremely heavily implied that everyone who is erased from existence did still have their souls stored in Origin, and as such are eligible to be reincarnated in the reborn worlds, albeit at the cost of their memories of Ionios, their relationships with people there, and the fact that a lot of people who might have been friends in the city would not meet those people again, because it seems very unlikely to me that all of those people will be reincarnated in the same generations as they were before, because the city had been around for 1,000 years. Either way, do whatever it takes for the greater good, at least as perceived by the person making that sacrifice, is something that Ouroboros carried on inheriting that will from Egil, even though I don't think any of them ever met him, and even if they did, they wouldn't remember within Ionios. As for Malos and friends, things get a bit more eerily similar, because in Xenoblade 3, it is the goal of the good guys to destroy the world, while the bad guys are the ones seeking to preserve it. And guess what stock villain motivation Malos had in Xenoblade 2? One of Noah's most iconic lines in the entire game is, "If the world holds our lives back, I will end it." And that is something that could easily have come out of the mouth of either Jin or Malos. So, yeah, I'm pretty sure Ouroboros is on a pretty similar wavelength to Torna. Also, plot-wise, while since Torna were the villains, they were working towards the same goal the entire time, and Ouroboros were the heroes, so they needed to figure things out about the world since they started in the dark, ultimately, by the end of the story, the goals of both groups are to head to the center of the world, to infiltrate the marvel of technology present there that is surrounded and shrouded by clouds, reach its innermost depths, meet the creator of the world, destroy them, and then destroy the world. If you don't think that was an intentional similarity, I don't think there's anything else in the game I could convince you actually is. And then there's my most controversial take, the idea that Egil and Malos would literally be fighting alongside Xenoblade 3's party members if they were put in an Ionio situation. And I think I can actually back that up. For Malos, it's significantly easier. He has explicitly been shown to, even in the present day after everything he's done and all that's happened to him, be capable of forming bonds with others, of empathy, of caring about people, and of doing things, in at least his own misguided way, of trying to help them and do things for them. So, personality-wise, I think he would mesh reasonably well with the main party. I feel like he would literally become a hero and be like, yeah, I like your style. I understand why you're doing what you want to do. I would be doing something like this in your situation as well, especially if as many people I loved had gotten hurt in similar ways. I would like to help you out. I have been known to be good at destroying things. I've been called the Endbringer once. I think I can provide something to you. Egil is obviously a little bit harder because he doesn't really have that angle. He clearly cared for his family members at one point. He was clearly genuinely good friends with Arglist before he got Zanzid, but he has the main issue of there being several thousand years between then and when he shows up in the main story, and it's very clear that he and Shulk would have been friends if they met sooner, but it's not really clear if they still would have become friends had Egil survived past what he did. Honestly, the best bet, if he does keep being aloof and not want to help out, would be either directly comparing things to what Zanza did, and pointing out that he can find some redemption for his crimes if he helps out here, or just taking Valdi, bringing him to whatever cave Egil is held up in, so that he can geek out over all the mechon Egil's been making and butter him up. Those would probably both work. But then, also, obviously, if we're viewing them in a normal Ionio soldier sense, where they'd have their memories wiped and be reduced to a younger state, in that case, they would join without a question. It is 100% in both of their personalities to want to succeed where Ouroboros also wants to succeed, and I think that's really interesting. Obviously, there's the whole nature versus nurture thing, and the fact that if the situations of their birth and life were different, there's no way Egil and Malas would have done any of the bad things they did. But I also think it is extremely interesting that, without really any caveats, anything alongside the I'm only teaming up with you so I can be the one to kill you later on thing, these two villains have lines that they wouldn't want to cross and have similar experiences to the party members where, with really no drawbacks, no strings attached, they would be teaming up with them to fight a greater villain. The Ouroboros characters, the main party of 3, are the embodiments of inherited will to push towards a better future. They carry on that torch from their predecessors in both the previous worlds of Xenoblade 1 and 2, the people of the city, all the other Ouroboros who died before them, all the previous incarnations of themselves who died before them, and that light from other universes entirely from Xenogears and Xenosaga. But they're not just taking that light from the good guys, they're taking it from everyone. Everyone who's lived and died, who's woven their stories into the great tapestry of existence, everyone who knows that it's not healthy to be stuck in the present, and that no matter what, you do have to keep walking on to the unknown future to come, is lending them their strength in a spiritual meta sort of way. They are taking all of those hopes and dreams, even of people who have died long before the Endless Now was created and can never be brought back, and using that as a driving force to motivate themselves to free everyone from the shackles of the Endless Now and from their own fears and anxieties. Tragic villains are usually only villains because of something bad that happened to them to make them that way, and it's a very common element in Xeno for the protagonists to realize that they owe it to those tragic villains to make sure that no one like them can ever happen again, usually by beating the actual big bad, and that was the case for Shulk, Rex, and their friends when it came to Egil and the members of Torna, and despite Ouroboros never meeting them, not even remembering potentially meeting Shulk, Rex, and their friends to learn that kind of lesson from them, and not really knowing what the world is supposed to be, only that it's wrong, Ouroboros 2 carries on that legacy. To quote a different Rex than the one you're probably thinking about, this one's a bit more of a generator than a driver, there's always going to be something, isn't there? And unfortunately, that is true. There are always going to be people who leverage what power they can find to improve their own lives at the expense of others, but there are always going to be people who resist that. There's almost a quarter century of Xeno to prove that, and I genuinely think it's beautiful that Ouroboros in Xenoblade 3, despite literally not knowing that's what they're doing, carries on the torch for everyone who resisted like that, not just the heroes, in a way that I think their predecessors would only be proud of. It's also another example of, for how much I'm annoyed at what Xenoblade 3 does wrong, I am even more annoyed at how it just becomes thematically tighter and more poignant the more I look deeply into it. But the rest of that is definitely for another day. I've talked enough for now. Until next time, this is Luxon, signing off.